Before we begin, there are certain people in history whose influence is obvious, and then there are people whose influence is almost invisible. Roy Cohn belongs to the second group. Most Americans have heard his name. Very few understand just how deeply he shaped one of the most controversial figures in modern politics. This isn't just the story of a lawyer, it's the story of how a young businessman learned a way of fighting that would later change American politics. So, tonight, let's go back to New York and let's meet the man Donald Trump never forgot. There was one name Donald Trump kept bringing up for decades. Not in campaign speeches, not in television interviews, but behind closed doors. Whenever he was facing a legal battle, a political crisis, or someone he believed could fight as hard as he did, Trump would often ask the same question: "Where's my Roy Cohn?" Think about that for a moment. Not, "Where's my best lawyer?" Not, "Who's the smartest attorney in New York?" No, "Where's my Roy Cohn?" Who was this man? Why did one lawyer leave such a deep mark on Donald Trump that nearly 40 years after his death, Trump was still measuring people against him? Most Americans know Roy Cohn as one of the most controversial lawyers in modern history. They remember the headlines: Joseph McCarthy, the Red Scare, Studio 54, political power, and eventually, disgrace. But that's only part of the story, because before Roy Cohn became a symbol of power, he became something much more personal. He became Donald Trump's mentor, not the kind of mentor who teaches you how to build buildings or negotiate contracts. Roy Cohn taught something far more dangerous. He taught a young businessman how to survive when the whole world seemed determined to destroy him. Whether you admire Donald Trump or strongly disagree with him, there's one question history forces us to ask: how much of the man we know today was already there? And how much was shaped by Roy Cohn? To answer that, we have to go back to New York City, the early 1970s. Donald Trump was only in his 20s. He wasn't a television celebrity. He wasn't a political figure. Outside New York real estate circles, almost nobody knew his name. His father, Fred Trump, was the real force behind the family business. Fred had spent decades building thousands of middle-class apartments across Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island. Donald was ambitious, confident, and impatient. He didn't want to spend his career managing apartment complexes in the outer boroughs. He wanted Manhattan. He wanted bigger buildings, bigger deals, bigger headlines. But before he ever had the chance to chase those dreams, everything nearly fell apart. Because in October 1973, the United States Department of Justice filed a civil lawsuit against the Trump Management Corporation. The accusation was explosive. Federal investigators claimed the company had systematically discriminated against black renters by refusing to rent apartments or steering applicants based on race. The lawsuit wasn't just aimed at the company, it named Fred Trump and Donald Trump. For a young businessman trying to build his reputation, this wasn't simply bad publicity, it threatened to define his entire future. Most lawyers would have offered the same advice: keep your head down, cooperate, negotiate quietly, avoid making the government angry. It sounded reasonable, it sounded responsible, it also sounded like surrender. Then someone introduced Donald Trump to a lawyer unlike anyone he had ever met. His name was Roy Cohn. Donald Trump expected to meet another lawyer. Instead, he walked into the office of a man who had already become a legend, not always for the right reasons. Roy Cohn wasn't simply well-connected, he was feared. Long before he met Trump, Cohn had made a name for himself as one of the youngest federal prosecutors in the country. At just 24 years old, he helped prosecute Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, the couple convicted of passing atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. The case made national headlines. To some Americans, Roy Cohn was a patriot. To others, he became a symbol of political ambition without limits. Then came Senator Joseph McCarthy. If you know anything about American politics in the 1950s, you've probably heard the term McCarthyism. It was a time when fear spread across America. Fear of communism, fear of Soviet spies, fear that the enemy wasn't overseas, but living next door. Roy Cohn became McCarthy's chief counsel. Together, they questioned government officials, military officers, professors, actors, almost anyone suspected of having communist ties. Their investigations dominated newspapers, television, Washington. Some people believed they were protecting America. Others believed they were destroying innocent lives. But regardless of which side you agreed with, everyone learned the same lesson. Roy Cohn never apologized. He never admitted weakness, and he never backed away from a fight. That reputation followed him long after the McCarthy era ended. By the early 1970s, Roy Cohn had reinvented himself. No longer a government lawyer, he became one of New York's most powerful private attorneys. His clients weren't ordinary businessmen. They were celebrities, real estate developers, union leaders, political insiders, people who didn't just want legal advice, they wanted protection, connections, influence, and if necessary, someone willing to fight dirty. Donald Trump had never met anyone quite like him. The meeting didn't feel like a legal consultation, it felt like entering another world. Trump explained the lawsuit. The federal government believed the Trump Organization had discriminated against black renters. The Justice Department had evidence, investigators, witnesses, documents. Most attorneys would have started discussing settlement options. Roy Cohn had a different question. Why are you letting them define the story? Donald looked surprised. Because until that moment, he believed the government was the one asking questions. Roy Cohn didn't see it that way. In his mind, every courtroom was also a stage. Every lawsuit was also a public relations battle. If the newspapers only reported one side, you were already losing. He leaned across the desk. Then came the advice that would shape Donald Trump's career for decades. Never let them hit you without hitting back. Not tomorrow, not after careful discussion, immediately. Fight, counterattack. Force your opponent to defend themselves. Whether you eventually won or lost in court, never allow people to think you accepted the accusation. To Roy Cohn, perception wasn't separate from victory. Perception was victory. Donald Trump had never heard anyone talk like that. Most lawyers managed risk. Roy Cohn created pressure. Most lawyers tried to calm the situation. Roy Cohn made the situation bigger, much bigger. Only weeks after the federal lawsuit was filed, Roy Cohn did something almost nobody expected. He filed a $100 million counterclaim against the United States government. Think about how shocking that sounded in 1973. A young real estate company, being sued by the federal government, was now accusing the government of violating its rights. The amount wasn't the point. Nobody seriously expected to collect $100 million. The message was, Roy Cohn wasn't trying to quietly win a lawsuit. He was announcing a war. Suddenly, newspapers weren't only asking whether the Trump Organization had discriminated against renters. Now reporters had another story. Why was this young businessman suing the United States government? Exactly what Roy Cohn wanted. The conversation had changed. Years later, Donald Trump would repeat one lesson again and again. When someone attacks you, don't spend all your time answering their accusations. Make them answer yours. Whether that strategy always worked is still debated today. But there's little doubt about where Trump first saw it in action. It wasn't in business school. It wasn't from his father. It wasn't from a political campaign. It was sitting across a desk, watching Roy Cohn turn a legal defense into a public offensive. For Donald Trump, this wasn't simply about one lawsuit anymore. It was a completely different way of looking at power. And he wanted to learn more, because what Roy Cohn taught next had almost nothing to do with the law. It had everything to do with winning. If you had asked almost any lawyer in New York what the Trump Organization should do next, the answer would have been predictable. Keep the case out of the headlines. Avoid making the government angry. Negotiate. Reach a settlement. Move on. That wasn't Roy Cohn's style. In fact, he believed that playing defense was the fastest way to lose. To him, lawsuits weren't just about judges and courtrooms. They were about momentum. If the public saw you defending yourself, they assumed you had done something wrong. So before the government could fully define Donald Trump, Roy Cohn decided to define the government. Within weeks, he filed a $100 million counterclaim against the U.S. Department of Justice. The legal claim itself had little chance of succeeding. Roy Cohn knew that. Donald Trump knew that. But success wasn't measured only inside a courtroom. It was measured on tomorrow morning's front page. Instead of reading, "Federal Government Sues Trump Company," people were suddenly reading, "Trump Fires Back." That may sound like a small difference. It wasn't. It completely changed the psychology of the story. Roy Cohn understood something most lawyers ignored. People rarely remember the details of a lawsuit. They remember who looked confident, who looked afraid, who looked like they were in control. Whether that's fair or not, it's how public opinion often works. Donald Trump was watching all of this unfold in real time. Every phone call, every press conference, every interview, every headline. For him, this wasn't just legal strategy anymore. It was a master class in media. Years later, Trump would say something that sounded almost impossible to believe. Bad publicity is sometimes better than no publicity. Whether you agree with that philosophy or not, you can see where the seeds may have been planted. Roy Cohn never tried to make controversy disappear. He learned how to use it. If reporters wanted conflict, give them conflict. If cameras were already outside, walk toward them. Never hide. Never look cornered. Most people think confidence comes from winning. Roy Cohn believes something completely different. Sometimes, confidence comes first, and victory follows. That idea fascinated Donald Trump, because his father had taught him how to build apartments. Roy Cohn was teaching him how to build an image. Those are not the same thing. One creates buildings, the other creates perception. And perception, especially in New York, could become its own form of power. But Roy Cohn wasn't finished. He noticed something else about his young client. Donald Trump didn't just want to survive this lawsuit. He wanted to become somebody bigger than Brooklyn, bigger than Queens, bigger than his father's business. He wanted Manhattan. Roy Cohn smiled, because that was a game he understood perfectly. In New York, money opened doors, but relationships opened entire buildings. Roy knew newspaper publishers, television producers, political donors, judges, developers, union leaders, nightclub owners, people who shaped conversations before the public ever heard them. Donald Trump had ambition. Roy Cohn had access. Together, they made a dangerous combination. For the first time in his life, Donald wasn't simply learning how powerful people made money. He was learning how powerful people stayed powerful. And the first lesson surprised him. Power wasn't always about having the strongest argument. Sometimes, it was about making sure everyone was talking about your argument instead. That lesson would stay with Donald Trump long after the housing lawsuit faded from the headlines. But Roy Cohn had one more principle, one that he repeated so often it almost became a personal religion. He believed there were only two kinds of people in the world: those who attacked and those who got attacked. There was no middle ground, no neutral position, no waiting to see what happened. If someone accused you, hit back harder. If someone questioned you, question them first. If someone tried to damage your reputation, make defending themselves their biggest problem. It was aggressive. It was controversial, and many critics believed it crossed ethical lines. But for a young Donald Trump, it was unforgettable because it offered something every ambitious 20-something desperately wants: certainty, simple rules, a way to respond when the pressure became unbearable. The lawsuit would eventually end with a settlement in which the Trump Organization agreed to certain housing practices while denying any wrongdoing. Both sides claimed they had won. That alone tells you how complicated public perception can be. Legally, the case was over. But personally, something much bigger had just begun. Donald Trump hadn't simply hired Roy Cohn. He had found a mentor, and Roy Cohn was about to teach him lessons that had nothing to do with courtrooms and everything to do with power. The lawsuit would eventually fade. Newspaper headlines always do. But Donald Trump wasn't walking away with just another legal experience. He was leaving with something far more valuable, a completely different way of thinking. For Roy Cohn, every crisis was a classroom. Every meeting, every interview, every lawsuit was an opportunity to teach. Not through lectures, through examples. Donald paid attention because he realized Roy Cohn wasn't simply reacting to events. He was usually 3 moves ahead. If a reporter called, Roy already knew the headline he wanted tomorrow morning. If an opponent made an accusation, Roy was already preparing a bigger accusation in return. He never waited for permission. He never waited for public opinion to turn in his favor. He tried to shape it. That was the first lesson. Control the narrative before someone else does. Roy believed that facts mattered, but he also believed something else mattered just as much. Who got to explain those facts first? Because once the public formed an opinion, changing it became much harder. Donald Trump watched Roy speak to reporters with remarkable confidence. Even when the situation wasn't favorable, Roy rarely sounded defensive. He answered difficult questions as though he had expected them all along. Then he would pivot, not away from the issue, but toward the message he wanted people to remember. It wasn't accidental. It was disciplined. Years later, political strategists would spend countless hours debating Trump's communication style. Some admired it, others criticized it. But one thing was difficult to ignore. He often refused to stay inside the question he was being asked. Instead, he tried to redirect the conversation. That approach looked very familiar to anyone who had watched Roy Cohn. Then came another lesson, one that Donald Trump would later repeat throughout business, television, and politics. Never allow your opponent to choose the battlefield. If someone criticized your business, talk about your success. If someone questioned your finances, talk about your projects. If someone attacked your character, challenge theirs. Don't fight the battle they prepared. Force them into one they didn't expect. It wasn't conventional. It wasn't always popular, but it kept Donald Trump from reacting like everyone else. Instead, he became the person setting the pace. Roy Cohn also understood something that couldn't be learned from law school. Power wasn't just about institutions, it was about people, relationships, access, trust, and sometimes fear. Walking through New York with Roy Cohn was unlike walking with anyone else. Restaurant owners knew him. Journalists recognized him. Politicians returned his phone calls. Judges knew his name. Some respected him. Some disliked him. Some openly feared him. But almost nobody ignored him. Donald noticed that. Influence wasn't measured by how many people agreed with you. Sometimes, it was measured by how impossible you were to ignore. That idea fascinated him, because his dream had never been to become another successful landlord. He wanted to become a name, a brand, someone whose presence alone changed the room. Roy Cohn understood branding long before the word became fashionable. He knew that attention, whether positive or negative, created leverage. If people were talking about you, you still had influence. Silence was far more dangerous. Donald absorbed that lesson almost immediately. He began understanding that publicity itself could become an asset. Not every headline needed to be positive. Sometimes, being the center of the conversation was enough. Looking back today, it's impossible not to notice echoes of those early lessons. From real estate announcements, to television appearances, to presidential campaigns, Donald Trump repeatedly showed an instinct for dominating the news cycle. Historians disagree on how much credit belongs to Roy Cohn. Trump was already ambitious, already competitive, already unusually confident. Roy Cohn didn't invent those qualities, but many historians argue that he gave them a framework, a repeatable strategy. In other words, he didn't create Donald Trump, he sharpened him. But every teacher eventually faces a moment their lessons can no longer protect them. For years, Roy Cohn had looked untouchable, the man who always knew someone more powerful, the lawyer who never seemed to lose, the fixer who could solve almost anything. Then, the world around him began to change. The political climate changed, the legal system changed, public opinion changed, and for the first time in decades, Roy Cohn found himself fighting a battle he couldn't control. The man who had taught Donald Trump how to fight was about to discover that not every enemy could be defeated, and the student was about to face the most uncomfortable lesson of all. What happens when your mentor becomes the one who needs saving? For years, Roy Cohn looked untouchable. If you only knew him from newspaper headlines, you'd think he always had another move, another connection, another powerful friend waiting behind the scenes. Whenever someone challenged him, he fought back. Whenever someone predicted his downfall, he somehow found a way to survive. That's why so many people believed Roy Cohn would never lose, including Donald Trump. But history has a way of humbling even the most powerful people. By the early 1980s, the world that had helped create Roy Cohn was disappearing. The political culture was changing, the media was changing, and federal investigators were paying closer attention to lawyers who had spent years operating near the edge of the rules. Then came another devastating blow. In 1986, after years of disciplinary investigations, Roy Cohn was disbarred. For a lawyer, there was no greater professional humiliation. The man who had built his entire reputation inside courtrooms was no longer allowed to practice law. Imagine that. The attorney who had spent decades teaching others how to fight could no longer stand in court himself. But Roy Cohn refused to admit defeat. Just as he had taught Donald Trump, he denied weakness. He insisted the accusations against him were politically motivated. He portrayed himself as the victim. Even now, he was following the very rules he had preached for decades. Never admit defeat. Never surrender the narrative. Fight until the very end. Then, another battle arrived, one that no amount of influence could stop. Roy Cohn became seriously ill. Publicly, he insisted he was suffering from liver cancer. Privately, the rumors spread quickly. Doctors, journalists, friends, many believed something else was happening. Eventually, it became widely understood that Roy Cohn was suffering from complications related to AIDS, though he publicly denied having the disease until the end of his life. To understand why that mattered, You have to remember America in the mid 1980s. Fear surrounded AIDS. So did stigma. Many patients were abandoned. Some lost careers. Others lost families. It was a disease surrounded by misunderstanding and panic. Roy Cohn, a man who had built his life around projecting strength, could not accept appearing vulnerable. So even while his health declined, he continued insisting on a different explanation. It was one final attempt to control the story. The same lesson he had taught Donald Trump years earlier. Control the narrative, even when reality becomes impossible to ignore. As Roy's health worsened, people around him noticed something they had never seen before. He was tired. He looked older. Meetings became shorter. His once endless energy began to fade. The man who had always seemed larger than life was becoming painfully human. Donald Trump watched all of this unfold. By then, his own career was taking off. His name appeared on buildings. His projects attracted national attention. He was becoming exactly what he had dreamed of years earlier. A Manhattan developer everyone recognized. The student was rising. The teacher was fading. Their relationship inevitably changed. For decades, people have debated exactly how close they remained during Roy Cohn's final months. Some friends believed Trump visited less often than Roy hoped. Others argued their relationship had simply evolved as both men faced different realities. What we do know is this. When Roy Cohn died on August 2nd, 1986, Donald Trump lost one of the most influential figures in his early career. He was only 39 years old, young enough to continue building an empire, but old enough to realize something important. The man he had relied on, the man who always seemed to know exactly what to do, was gone, and there would never be another Roy Cohn. Or so he thought. Because the most powerful lesson Roy Cohn left behind wasn't written in any legal brief. It wasn't found in any courtroom. It lived inside the person who had been watching him all those years. Donald Trump. Years later, people would argue endlessly about Trump's personality, his confidence, his communication style, his willingness to confront opponents head-on. Were those qualities always part of who he was? Probably. But there's another question, one that historians still ask today. Without Roy Cohn, would Donald Trump have fought the same way? Or did one extraordinary mentor give an already ambitious young businessman a strategy that would shape the rest of his life? That question still doesn't have a simple answer, but the story isn't over, because sometimes the greatest influence a teacher has isn't what he says, it's what the student chooses to become. Roy Cohn died in August 1986. The headlines came and went. Friends moved on. Critics wrote their final opinions. New York found new power brokers. Life continued. But for Donald Trump, something had changed forever. Years passed. Trump's real estate empire expanded. His name appeared on hotels, casinos, office towers, and eventually on a television show watched by millions. Then came politics, a presidential campaign that many experts dismissed from the very beginning. Yet throughout every stage of that journey, people who had known Roy Cohn kept noticing something familiar. Not the words, not the voice, the instincts. When Trump was criticized, he counterattacked. When opponents tried to define him, he tried to define them first. When controversy erupted, he rarely stepped away from it. Instead, he stepped into it. Whether people admired that approach or strongly opposed it, few could deny its consistency. It reflected lessons that had been learned decades earlier in a lawyer's Manhattan office. Of course, Donald Trump was never simply a copy of Roy Cohn. He had his own personality, his own ambitions, his own decisions. No mentor can completely shape another human being. But mentors can change how people think, and sometimes That changes everything. As Trump's public life grew larger, he occasionally made a remark that caught the attention of those who remembered Roy Cohn. Whenever he felt disappointed by the people around him, he would sometimes ask, "Where's my Roy Cohn?" It wasn't really a question, it was a comparison. He wasn't looking for another lawyer. He was looking for someone with absolute loyalty, someone who would never hesitate, never retreat, never tell him to compromise. In other words, he was looking for someone who didn't exist anymore. Because Roy Cohn had been unique, brilliant to some, dangerous to others, admired by loyal friends, condemned by fierce critics. Even today, historians disagree sharply about his legacy. Some describe him as one of the most ruthless attorneys in American history. Others argue that he simply understood power better than almost anyone else of his generation. Both views continue to exist, and perhaps they always will, but regardless of where someone stands, one fact is difficult to ignore. Roy Cohn's influence reached far beyond the courtroom. It extended into American business, into media, and eventually, into the White House. Not because Roy Cohn lived to see it, he didn't, but because one of his most attentive students did. History often remembers presidents. It remembers billionaires. It remembers famous elections. Much less often, it remembers the teachers standing quietly behind them, the people who never became president, but helped shape the people who did. Roy Cohn was one of those figures, a man whose own story ended in 1986, yet whose influence continued for decades afterward. So when people ask, who taught Donald Trump how to fight? There probably isn't a single answer. His father taught him discipline, New York taught him competition, business taught him risk, politics taught him survival, but Roy Cohn taught him something different. He taught him that every public battle is fought twice, once in reality, and once in the minds of the people watching. Whether that lesson strengthened American politics or damaged it depends entirely on whom you ask. But no serious study of Donald Trump's rise is complete without understanding the man who stood beside him in the beginning. The lawyer, the fixer, the mentor, the man Trump spent the rest of his life comparing everyone else to, Roy Cohn. And perhaps that's why, decades after his death, one simple question continued to echo through Donald Trump's life. Where's my Roy Cohn? Not because he needed another attorney, but because he never found another Roy Cohn. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to explore the people and moments that shaped modern history, consider subscribing and joining us for the next chapter. Because history isn't only made by the people standing in the spotlight, sometimes it's made by the people standing just outside it. History never ends. There's always another story waiting to be told. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next story.